We wanted to ground the webinar in an understanding of the basic requirements for temporary protected status. And for those of you who maybe are not as familiar with asylum and temporary protected status, I wanted to kind of outline, because the focus of our webinar is on kind of looking at both of these things in tandem, that Afghan evacuees may be eligible for, kind of what are the similarities, what are the differences, to kind of help inform our discussion. So at sort of the macro level, the similarities are that, let's see, they both provide for work authorization. And this is a really important consideration for Afghan evacuees who, I think, as many of you know, many of whom were admitted to the United States starting in the summer of 2021 for a period of 2 years in this temporary status called parole, which is going to start expiring for people starting in August, 2 years from when they entered the United States. And people's work authorization is tied to their parole. And so this is one of the important considerations around applying for temporary protected status. And so one of the important similarities between a grant of asylum and a grant of temporary protected status is work authorization, but there are a lot of differences. Temporary protected status, as its title suggests, is a temporary status, and it has to be renewed. Right now, for Afghans, temporary protected status can last up until November 20th of this year. Asylum is granted for an indefinite period. Asylum, it provides a pathway to a green card, to permanent status in the United States. TPS does not. There's no pathway to a green card. TPS may be extended numerous times, but it doesn't have any built-in pathway to apply for a green card and therefore to apply for citizenship later. So it's not a permanent form of protection. Asylum has a built-in pathway for the asylee's spouse and children to get asylum. TPS doesn't have that. But on the other hand, asylum is pretty complicated in terms of the legal requirements for showing someone's eligible. And there's a pretty complicated application process with lots of detailed information that needs to be filed, legal arguments to be made, a long asylum interview. But also the process is free. TPS, on the other hand, is a lot simpler from a legal perspective, and I'll walk you through in a minute the requirements for TPS. The application itself is pretty simple. There's generally no interview involved. There are fees for TPS, although they can be waived, but you need to apply for a fee waiver, which is another complicated application to get that. So just kind of like with that in mind, those differences and similarities between asylum and TPS, I want to dive into talking about what is TPS and what are the requirements for Afghans to get TPS. And so our next slide looks at the basic eligibility for TPS. And I should say, for those of you who are not familiar, TPS again stands for temporary protected status. And this is a status that's available to people from a variety of countries. And under the statute, the executive branch has authority to make a determination that people who are nationals of a particular country where there's been some kind of disaster, whether natural or human-made, the executive branch can designate that people from that country can get temporary protected status in the US. So often this might be a natural disaster that prompts a designation of temporary protected status. For instance, there was a massive earthquake in Nepal some years ago, and Nepal was designated for TPS because once that earthquake happened, a lot of the country was facing a massive humanitarian crisis, and it just was not humanitarian to send people back there. So right now, I actually don't have the exact list of every single country that's currently designated for TPS, but there are a number of them. Many because of natural disasters, but some because of human-caused disasters. For instance, Cameroon is also designated for TPS because of the ongoing serious civil strife in that country. And Afghanistan was designated for TPS after the US withdrawal and the takeover by the Taliban and the ensuing massive humanitarian crisis that's going on there. So, with that said, what are the basic eligibility requirements for an Afghan to have TPS, this temporary status that is currently available to people through November 20th of 2023, You have to be a national of Afghanistan, and so you'll need to prove in some way that you are from Afghanistan, or you're a stateless person who was last habitually residing in Afghanistan. I don't think that will cover too many people. So most people will be showing that they are a national of Afghanistan. And then for TPS generally, there's always requirements that you've been continuously residing in the US since a certain date and physically present in the US since a certain date. And for Afghanistan, the relevant dates here are that you were continuously residing in the US since March 15th, 2022, and you've been continuously physically present in the US since May 20th of that year. I don't really even remember why there are those distinctions of two different dates in the statute, but that's the way it is. Those are the requirements. There's a slight difference between residing and physically present. I think for most Afghan evacuees, they're going to be submitting the same evidence, and the vast majority of Afghan evacuees, I believe, have not left the United States since they got here. And so this should not be a major issue for them. The idea with residing in the US is this means, like, where do you actually live? Where's your dwelling place? Where's your home? Physically present is a slightly different concept, not where's your home, but like, where are you physically located? But for both of these, there's exceptions for what's called, if you leave the US for what's called a brief, casual, and innocent reason, meaning you left on a short trip and you weren't going off to do something illegal. That's essentially the idea here. So if somebody did leave the US for a brief period, as long as they weren't going off to do something illegal, that shouldn't be a problem for continuous residence and continuous physical presence. And as I said, for the vast majority of Afghan evacuees, I think people have not left the United States, in large part because they wouldn't really have a way to get back in from their parole status. And so we'll talk later about how to document this, but I don't think either of these should be a major issue for most people. Right now, applicants are, TPS is valid until November 20th of 2023. So you may be thinking, well, what happens after that? Is there any purpose in even applying now if it's going to run out so soon? So TPS generally is designated in 18-month increments, and that means the executive branch, so DHS and the Department of State, have to get together and decide before, I think within about 60 days, although of the end of that TPS period, whether or not they're going to extend TPS. We all assume that that's going to happen for Afghanistan, since clearly conditions in the country have, if anything, gotten worse since TPS was initially designated. So I think we have every reason to assume that, yes, they will extend TPS after November 20th of 2023, but we won't know that for certain until it happens. And people who register for TPS in this initial period then have to keep, you have to file a re-registration every time TPS is renewed. That's actually a simpler application than the first one. I also, before I go on and very quickly touch on some of the bars to TPS, I also just want to point all of you to resources about finding out the rules for TPS, if you're not familiar with this. The regulations that govern all of this and set up this whole scheme for TPS and include all the eligibility requirements are found at 8 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 244. That's the section that deals with temporary protected status. So if you're not familiar with those and have questions about TPS eligibility, it's always best to go to the source and look at the law, and that's where you'll find the law on TPS. USCIS, which makes determinations on TPS applications, also has a very helpful TPS page on their website, and I put the link there, and they have separate pages for each nationality that's currently designated for TPS that talks all about who is eligible, what are the eligibility requirements, where do you file, how does re-registration work, kind of all the answers that you might, or many of them, you can find on the USCIS page. Then I want to talk, it's also possible, by the way, to do late initial filing. So I just want to flag that as well for Afghan, because this can be a consideration. As I said, TPS, there is an application form, there's a bunch of papers to put together, and it's not free. So there may be some applicants who may want to wait and see. It is possible to do a late initial filing of TPS if you didn't initially file for TPS in this first time that it's designated. And some of the reasons that you're allowed to do a late initial filing is that during the initial registration period, you had an application for asylum pending or an application for adjustment of status, which might be somebody who is in the process of applying for a special immigrant visa. Also, if you were a parolee, or had a pending request for reparole, there may be an option for that for Afghans, we don't know. Or you are the spouse or child of somebody who was given TPS during the initial period. So it can be possible for people to file for TPS after November 20th if they fall into one of these categories, which many Afghan evacuees may fall into that category. So then I really want to just kind of look very quickly into some of the things that can bar people, even though they may meet these requirements of being an Afghan who's been continuously living in the US since March 15th, 2022, has been physically present in the US since May 20th, 2022. Some of those people are still not going to be eligible for TPS. There are certain things that can bar you. And on the next slide, we kind of look carefully at those things. Generally speaking, if you're familiar with bars to asylum, the bars to asylum also apply to TPS. So this is relevant if you're working with somebody who is applying for both or thinking about applying for both. The bars to asylum also apply in TPS, and there's some additional bars that also apply in TPS. The ones that I've put up here, this is not an exhaustive list because we're not doing an in-depth training on TPS itself. But I wanted to flag the ones that may be most likely to come up and to be an issue for Afghan evacuee cases, and that typically cannot be waived. So the bars to asylum, firm resettlement, terrorism-related admissibility grounds. I'll talk a bit about more about those on the next slide. And persecutors of others, though, this is what if we can actually go back, Karen, sorry, to the previous slide. Persecutors of others. This is a real issue for some of the people in the Afghan evacuee pool. If you are somebody who has persecuted others, you've ordered, assisted, or participated in the persecution of other people based on their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, which if you know anything about asylum, you know this mirrors the asylum definition. If you're somebody who has persecuted others, you're going to be barred from TPS. You'll also be barred from asylum. And we're seeing this come up very much with certain particular groups among the Afghan evacuee population. So we really want to flag this. People who maybe worked alongside the US military, maybe were even paid and given orders by the US military, may have engaged in acts that can constitute persecution of others. And I'm speaking particularly of people who were in something called the KPF, the Coast Protection Force, what the so-called zero units. Even though they may have worked and did work alongside the United States under the orders of US personnel, they may have engaged in acts that constitute persecution of others and can be barred for TPS. And we're going to delve more in a few minutes into how to screen for that and flag that. Also, people who are in the Afghan military might or might not have engaged in persecution of others, people who worked in jails, detention centers, police, all of those kind of roles that involve weapons, that involve detention of other people. You're going to want to screen very carefully for potential persecutor bar issues. Also, just want to flag that there are a number of different crimes that can bar people from TPS. I think that overall, this particular category is maybe a little bit less of an issue for this population, simply because they haven't been in the United States that long, and many of these criminal bars relate to convictions in the United States, a felony conviction in the United States. Given that people just haven't been there that long, there's a lower likelihood that someone has had time to have a felony conviction in the United States. However, that said, there are a number of different convictions that can bar you from TPS. And so the overall message here is, if you think there's any chance that someone has a criminal conviction in the United States, or maybe committed some kind of serious crime outside the United States, you're going to want to really screen that carefully and get expert advice about how to handle that. And then I just also want to delve quickly for a moment deeply yet quickly on the next slide into two of these other bars to TPS, firm resettlement and the terrorism-related admissibility grounds, because these are bars to asylum that also apply in TPS, where we're seeing issues that commonly arise in the Afghan evacuee population. So people who were firmly resettled in a third country before getting to the United States, which essentially means having a permanent status like a green card in another country before you get to the United States is a bar to TPS. And so we're seeing many Afghans, of course, came through other countries on the way to the US, and some people may have been given or offered some kind of status in a third country. And that's really what you're going to be wanting to look at. Layovers and stops between evacuation and arrival to the US, that is not an issue in terms of the firm resettlement bar. So people were flown to Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Germany and all sorts of places and may have stayed there for a little while en route to the US. That's not an issue. But somebody where people was given some kind of permanent status or offered some permanent status in another country, you're going to be wanting to look at that to see if there's a potential firm resettlement issue. And finally, I just want to flag as well the terrorism-related admissibility grounds. This is a huge topic, and I know that Adoni is going to be able to share later. There's some further training coming up that's going to talk further about this. This is something that's a bar to asylum, also a bar to TPS, but has turned out to be less of an issue in the context of Afghan cases because USCIS, DOS allowed certain situational exemptions for certain Afghans in June of 2022 that I think is really going to overall help this population. Afghan civil servants, Afghan allies, and people who provided the oxymoronically titled insignificant or limited material support to the Taliban or other groups are going to be eligible for an exemption to the terrorism-related ground. So anybody who worked or provided any kind of help in any way to the Taliban or other groups and/or was a member of any kind of group fighting the Taliban, because membership in what the US considers to be a terrorist group is also a bar. That's something you're going to want to look at carefully as to whether or not it might bar someone from TPS. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alana.
Thank you, Jenny. Karen, could you just go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to talk just a little bit, and these bullets, as I look at them, I realize they're not really in any particular order, and maybe the fourth should be at the top in red with lots of underlines and quotation marks and all of the emojis. But just sort of some like practical tips for how to screen for these bars and how to talk to clients about them, and how to sort of navigate building up a factual record and sort of figuring out where you are in that legal landscape that Jenny just laid out for us so clearly. And then we're going to talk about sort of this intersection between asylum and TPS and the strategic implications and questions about whether to apply for one or both or when and the timing. So I'm going to jump down and take the fourth bullet first, because this is, I think, probably to my mind, the most important thing. And I think it's something that we as lawyers have a tendency to forget sometimes. But I think that the best possible way for the best thing that you can do for a client is to help the client understand the law. And especially when we're talking about a lot of these bars, which are very sort of amorphous and hard to pin down factually, helping the client understand why what you're asking is important, I think is really critical. Some of the bars are very concrete. I mean, like a US conviction for one or felony or one or more misdemeanors. Like that's fairly clear. You need to know the immigration definition of a conviction. You need to be able to figure out whether it's a felony or misdemeanor, and you need to be able to count to two. But a lot of the other ones, a lot of the other criminal bars, the terrorism related bars, and then a lot of the bars that sort of intersect between asylum and TPS, persecutor of others and firm resettlement, are are really complicated, and helping clients to understand why they're so important and why you're asking what you're asking, I think is going to help them to help you a lot more than just sort of digging in, asking questions in a vacuum. So just, a few things. Some of the some of the criminal grounds of inadmissibility don't require a conviction. This is important for clients to understand. And of course, conviction has a different meaning in the immigration context than it has in a lot of the criminal contexts. So there are, as we know, plenty of people who were told by judges in the United States, criminal judges in the United States, this is not a conviction. You can tell everyone that you don't have a conviction, who have in fact been convicted for immigration purposes. And then sort of shifting to the records question, keep in mind and make sure that your clients know that DHS has access to both domestic and international criminal records databases, and we don't even know what they are. So the biometrics appointments that all of our clients have to go through, the purpose of those is for DHS to run name and background checks, and the list of agencies with which they run those security checks are in and of themselves secret. So we don't know which databases they use. I know they get Interpol, just because I've had clients come back with Interpol red notices. But I think it's important for clients to understand that although the US may not be communicating information to foreign governments about their asylum applications or the fact that they've applied, DHS is able to access international criminal records databases as well as domestic ones. They also have access to Department of State records. So for clients, and this isn't applicable to the Afghan evacuees who were airlifted out the summer before last, but if you run across clients who either came on a visa or in the past applied for a visa, those Department of State interview records are accessible to DHS. And sometimes we see statements that clients made or allegedly made in a visa interview come back to bite them in an asylum application or even in a TPS application. And then just more broadly, in addition to having access to other agencies' records, of course, DHS has access to the records of other bureaus within DHS. So USCIS, in adjudicating a TPS application, will also be able to access a client's asylum application, work authorization application, and they do cross-check them in it. So any inconsistencies between what somebody says in a TPS application, what somebody says in an asylum application, can really cause problems down the line. Karen, could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the big question, to file for TPS or not to file for TPS. The deadline is looming, the clock is ticking, everyone's trying to figure this out. And there's pros and cons to filing for TPS at all. And then there's the question of timing, which Adonia is going to get into in a lot more detail in a minute. But let's just sort of run through, the scales as they balance out. So the pros of filing for TPS are, of course, to maintain work authorization without gaps. A lot of the Afghans who came in summer and fall of 2021 have work authorization documents, which were issued contingent on their status as parolees. So the parole that they were granted was granted for a period of 2 years. Those parole documents and their accompanying work authorization documents are all going to start expiring, when those 2 years come up in August and September and October and November of this year. So those people are looking at losing work authorization if they don't figure out some other basis to apply. And for those who are either in the process of applying for asylum or have applied for asylum, many of them will become eligible to apply for work authorization based on having a pending asylum application, but the rules are different. So you can apply for work authorization at the same time that you apply for TPS, and many people get the work authorization based on having a pending TPS before their TPS application itself is actually granted. But asylum, of course, is different. You can't apply for work authorization based on a pending asylum application until the asylum application has been pending itself for 150 days. So there's sort of timing considerations, and maybe, filing for TPS quickly might prevent someone from a gap in employment authorization that they wouldn't be able to fill with an asylum pending application. People are in general required to apply for asylum within 1 year of coming to the United States. And the statute says if you don't apply within that first year, then you're barred from filing for asylum. The regs sort of clarify there's 2 exceptions to that general filing deadline, and the regulations clarify that having some other legal status, so parole in the case of the Afghans who are here now, or TPS, can constitute an exceptional circumstance that excuses the filing deadline. So if somebody's just not going to be ready to file for asylum before their parole expires and they want more time, or they're not sure they want to apply for asylum, filing for TPS can sort of give a little bit of a buffer, keep work authorization, and give them more time to prepare an asylum application. Of course, it maintains lawful status in addition to work authorization. As Jenny said, it's so much simpler. Filling out a TPS application is like exponentially easier than applying for asylum. Asylum is a massive undertaking, both for the client, frankly, and for the lawyer. And for some people, some people just don't want to stay in the United States forever, or they're not sure. And so for some people, just getting TPS might be plenty. And of course, they would continue the ORR benefits that the parolees were granted as a result of the airlift. So on the other side, okay, so TPS is certainly easier to apply for than asylum, but there's still the expenditure of time and resources. There are, as Jenny said, filing fees. And, you can apply for a fee waiver. The fee waiver itself is a monstrously long form and requires a lot of documentation, and it can be denied. And it'll probably delay adjudication, both of the work authorization application and of the TPS application itself. And then, to the extent that a lot of the bars to TPS that Jenny mentioned, they come from the asylum statute, right? They just incorporate the bars to asylum in section 208. And it's the very same bars. And sort of there's a sort of strategic consideration, like, do you want to be presenting arguments that your client is not, in fact, subject to one of these bars to a contract USCIS officer at a service center? Or are you better off making that argument to an asylum officer who's trained to some extent in these issues, or potentially to an immigration judge in the context of an asylum application? And that sort of leads into the last consideration here, which is that if someone applies for asylum to USCIS, to the asylum office, and that person is not in lawful status at the time, bless you, Karen, when the asylum application is adjudicated, the asylum office can grant the application, and that's great. If the asylum office does not grant the application, if that person doesn't have any other lawful status, then the asylum office refers the case to immigration court, issues a notice to appear, which commences removal proceedings, and just forwards the application on to a judge. You don't have to refile an asylum application, you just renew it in front of an IJ. And that's very beneficial to a lot of people. Having a day in court and being able to just have that application reconsidered by an immigration judge, make legal arguments, update the evidence. For a lot of people, that's in their best interests. If someone has lawful status at the time the asylum officer decides to not grant asylum, the AO can't commence removal proceedings because the person has lawful status and they're not removable. So instead of sending the case to court, the asylum officer just denies the application. So that question of whether or not you want to run the risk of winding up in immigration court, or another way to talk about it is have the benefit of a day in court, is another consideration on whether to file for asylum and TPS at the same time, to do one first and the other later. And with that, Karen, could you go to the next slide, please? And I think I'm turning it over Adonia here to talk about work authorization.
Yes, and before, I think timing is a really big consideration. Probably the biggest consideration is the bars and eligibility. If you have concerns about the bars for asylum eligibility and TPS eligibility, explore that first. But another consideration is timing, and like looking at as people's clocks tick down to the expiration of their parole. And before I jump into this graphic, I do want to note earlier about the cases being referred or denied. Do anticipate if somebody is denied asylum due to any of the bars, perhaps a persecutor bar, there's still a very good chance that the TPS would be revoked and an NTA filed. So people may eventually end up in removal proceedings regardless, even if they did somehow have temporary protected status. We'll have to wait and see how that all plays out. But if there is a denial based on one of the bars, it could really be an issue. So timing, we thought it'd be helpful to do a visual graphic to lay out the timing of whether or not you might want to consider applying for TPS for your clients. So let's say you have not filed for asylum, and let's say you file for asylum, you and your clients file for asylum today. We know that you have to wait the 150 days before you can file for work authorization. So if you file today, you're looking at July 29th for the day that you can file for the work authorization, and approval will be at the 180-day mark. We are hearing a lot of reports from our office too. We saw where it was adjudicated when we filed electronically, which is a rather easy process to file that work authorization, that C8 work authorization based on the pending asylum application online. It was adjudicated on the 180th day. So that should be a consideration as you move forward and you're doing these filings. Weigh the differences between filing online. We are seeing much quicker adjudications versus filing on paper. So if you're filing for asylum in the near future, or you've already filed for asylum, it's very likely that the individual may be able to get work authorization based on a pending asylum application prior to the expiration of parole. So the TPS application may not be as necessary. And should something happen later on, there is always the option to file a late registration. There was a lot of discussion in the Q&A about processing times. It has been noted that we have not had any official information about processing times. It's not on USCIS's website for processing times for Afghan TPS cases. We're hearing reports for cases where there are no issues, where there's no potential persecutor bar or trig issues, that they are being processed in about 4 to 6 months. So let's say you guys go out and decide to assist a client in applying for TPS in the coming weeks, and you file on March 15th, you're probably looking at an approval sometime in the beginning of July. So your client would have that continuous, they would have continuous status and work authorization prior to the expiration of parole. So that's a really important consideration. There was also a question in the Q&A regarding adjustment of status. I searched high and low in advance to this presentation to try to get some more information about how long SIV adjustment work authorizations are taking. I haven't been able to gather that information. If anyone does happen to know, I would appreciate if you would put it in the Q&A. But that's another consideration. Do you have an SIV adjustment pending? Did you apply for the work authorization in conjunction with that adjustment of status application? When information is available on the processing length of that, that would be another consideration in applying for TPS. So timing is something that should be factoring into the conversations that you're having with your client. Something Alana said that I think is extremely important is having these conversations, making sure your clients understand the benefits, maybe the cons, the risks for doing this whole, for proceeding with temporary protected status. So hopefully this visual is really helpful. Consider the timing in addition to any potential bars. Next slide. All right, so documenting. Thankfully, I hope you all are involved. There's a lot of listservs out there for people working with Afghan evacuees. I encourage you to get on them and follow them. A lot of this information I'm going to be sharing here is actually based on redacted RFEs that have been received and shared on the listserv. So we're really grateful for people sharing their experiences because it allows us to provide you more comprehensive information about what we're seeing and what some of the potential issues may be as these applications are filed. So first of all, physical presence. We've heard some reports on listservs that people don't file very much evidence because there's this presumption that people are here and they haven't left. We do think it's good practice. We have heard some reports of RFEs for additional documentation about presence and residence. So we do encourage you to do something for at least every quarter and think creatively around evidence. USCIS's website and the 821 instructions give some examples, medical records, leases, pay stubs. But in the past, we've used things like social media check-ins that have a geotag, COVID vaccines or boosters. There's a lot of things out there that are kind of outside the list that's provided by USCIS that could establish that someone is physically present and residing here in the United States. The most important thing when you're looking at the present documentation is make sure that an address in the United States is listed and the applicant's name and that there's something that has a date on it. Best practice is something every quarter. We have heard reports that people have done less and it's gotten approved, but it really behooves you to provide as much documentation as you can to avoid any sort of request for evidence. Also, when it comes to identity documentation, nationality documentation, passport, birth certificate, the tazkara, that's all things that could be used to establish that you are a national of Afghanistan. For some reason, if that information is not available, you can provide secondary evidence, whether it's affidavits or some sort of other documentation, but you need to establish first that this primary evidence that's listed, the passport, the birth certificate, the national identity document is not available. And this is the following information about all the military service. I do want to give a big thank you to the listservs and the individuals who shared these RFEs. So these are in regards to the questions that explore involvement in various military groups and prisons, detention facilities, and from the request for evidence, this is the information that's being requested. So it would be a good idea before filing a TPS application, make sure to explore this thoroughly with your client, but then also include this in the explanation. So as you can see here on this slide, military service, you want to include the type of group, the name of the squad, the time period, the rank or position, commanding officer, duties, trainings. You all can read this slide, and we will be sharing the slides following the webinar. That was one of the Q&A's questions. So we will be sharing this, so please don't worry about writing this all down. And these are all questions that are getting towards the potential bars. These are getting at trying to elicit information. And this also goes back to why it's so important to look at other applications that have been filed to make sure that there's consistency, whether or not there needs to be updates to the asylum application, or just making sure the information is consistent. So in regards to the prison and detention facilities, question 31B, this is the information that you should be discussing and getting the information on and including in the explanation. Next slide. And then also a group that used weapons, provided transport or provided weapons, and any sort of military or weapons training. The information is all very similar, but again, kind of eliciting the information that may raise questions about some sort of bar. So make sure to explore this. I do want to note there may be applicants that are not eligible for TPS. There may be real concerns around persecutor bar. So explore these issues prior to filing, and it may not be the best course for your clients. So hopefully this information is helpful. Again, the listservs are providing information as these cases start developing, as new requests for evidence come out. So really follow that closely and have that be part of your practice and working on these TPS cases. Another thing that I did want to let folks know, Lance Conklin has put together a nice document about the persecutor bar. He has given us permission to share that after the webinar in the materials. So individuals that want to take a closer look at these issues and some best practices and questions you should be asking, as well as case law, please take a read through that. All right, next slide.
Okay. So I'm actually going to shift gears because I realize I covered a lot of this earlier. Sort of the what happens if the asylum office denies the application, and sort of the when you wind up in court and when you don't. So maybe we can just take a few minutes and talk about like a few examples of times when I think that maybe people are better off in court. And this is with all of the caveats that, like, I practice in a place where our immigration court is fairly reasonable and our asylum office is not. And like, you know, I'm sort of biased in favor. I like talking to judges. So take this with all the grains of salt. Jenny's laughing at me because she knows that. But just a few things have come up in the chat in the last few minutes. They just want to jump on. So one is somebody asked, like, are immigration judges going to adjudicate asylum applications, I-589, so asylum withholding CAT applications for people who have TPS? And of course, you know, judges can, like, people have a right to apply for asylum. And there's nothing that prevents an immigration judge from adjudicating an asylum withholding CAT application on the merits, even if the person has TPS or if they have TPS pending. Practically, what I've seen, and this is again with all the caveats and the grains of rice and purely anecdotal, is that judges don't want to do it, right? They want to get cases off of their dockets. They're overloaded. They're under a lot of pressure to get their numbers down. And what I've seen in a few different courts is, you know, DHS comes in and they've even filed motions to terminate for people who had not even applied for TPS yet, but who seemed to be eligible. And so if you really think that there's a case that would be better off in court, you know, just applying for TPS might get you booted out of immigration court, even if you're already there. Another things that came up in the chat was there's a good number of Afghans who are arriving now along the southern border. These are not people who were paroled in. Karen, we can see all of those folders that you're opening. And you know, so these people are going to wind up in removal proceedings immediately. And the question had to do with firm resettlement. So apparently some at least are been going through Brazil and be getting some kind of a humanitarian visa in Brazil. And the question is, would this constitute firm resettlement? So firm resettlement is a bar to TPS. It's also a bar to asylum. The basic rule for firm resettlement is it's triggered by an offer or potential availability. So you don't even have to have applied, but if there was an option of some kind of indefinite legal status, unrestricted legal status, something that's basically akin to permanent residence in the United States. something that indefinite and unrestricted, that constitutes firm resettlement. So whether, and then there's exceptions. So one exception is if their actions were significantly and consciously restricted in that third country. And another exception has to do with someone who was only in the third country as a necessary consequence of their flight from persecution, didn't form any lasting ties, and only remained long enough to arrange onward travel. Anyway, all this to say, firm resettlement is one of those things that I think you're much better off arguing to an immigration judge in court than to an asylum officer, or frankly, certainly to a USCIS officer. And I don't know the answer to the particular question. I don't know Brazilian law. I don't know what these humanitarian visas in Brazil are. But I think that's one of those things you just have to do the research and figure out what the Brazilian law is. But then I think there's a separate question: which forum do you want to be in for that? And I think a lot of the sort of crim questions are similar questions of discretion. So I think unless Jenny or Adonia, you have other sort of specific thoughts on this, I will leave it at that. Move on. Okay. Next slide, please. And I think I'm turning it back over to Jenny here.
Thank you so much, Alana. And all of you, by the way, are asking such great questions in the chat. We are noting all of them. And we'll try to figure out a way to follow up on some of these other great questions that we may not have been able to address during today's webinar. So this is just to reiterate what we have already touched on during the webinar and in responses to some of your questions in the chat, is that when you have people applying for both asylum and TPS, it's really important to make sure that there's consistency between those applications. You can absolutely expect that USCIS is going to be looking at both of them, and that whoever's adjudicating one will have access to the other application. And so it's probably very common, though, for many applicants that they may be working with one lawyer or one organization for one application and somebody totally different for the other one. And so it's really, really important if you're working with someone, say, who wants help with one of them, to find out, did they apply for the other thing, and to do everything you can to get your hands on that application so you can see how the questions were answered on there. And if the client is answering something differently to you than what's put in their other application, you're going to need to address that and discuss that and figure out what's going on there. Why is that? Do you need to amend the other application in some way, provide an explanation? But what you don't want to do is have this person submit two applications that say different things on different applications. Because again, many of the same bars apply. Really, really important to make sure that there's consistency between those. And with that, I think we're ready for the resources.
Thank you so much to Jenny, Ilana, and Adonia. I'll talk about a few of these resources, and we only have a few minutes left. The Welcome Legal Alliance, I will take a moment and show you the website in just a second. We also have, thanks to the American Bar Association, a TPS clinic toolkit for legal service providers, which is available on the website, which I will show you as well. Vicina also has a TPS teachable course that is coming soon. And on our information hub for the Welcome Legal Alliance, we do have an Ask the Expert functionality where if you are a practitioner or a legal service provider who has questions about the asylum application process and the intersection between the asylum application process and TPS for your clients and the folks that you're serving, you can ask questions there. And one of the experts at our amazing partner organizations will be able to answer that for you. And of course, there is the opportunity to both volunteer, and if you are seeking legal assistance, if you are an Afghan who has come here to the United States is seeking assistance with your asylum application, then this is a website where you can find that as well. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to share a different screen, which will show you the website that you can go to. Here we go. Here's the website for the Welcome Legal Alliance. It is welcome.us/Legal Alliance. This is where you can sign up to volunteer. And we are actively seeking volunteers, pro bono attorneys, as well as paralegals, and many other helpers, attorneys and non-attorneys alike. There's a role for you to play in this work. You can start your volunteer journey by signing up. But then thanks to Vicina and our partners, we have very specific training on-ramps that you can take that will get you involved in this work directly. I will also show you that if you click on toolkits and assistance, this right here is where you can click to access any of our toolkits. It is just a simple Airtable form. We have these wonderful toolkits that provide everything that legal service providers need to do limited scope legal services for Afghans who are putting together their asylum applications, and of course the new temporary protected status clinics for Afghans toolkit that the ABA has put together. If you are a local partner and you want to work with us in standing up some of these clinics, you can request implementation support. And here is where you can click to ask an expert your question. And then finally, under information for Afghan newcomers, please, if you or you are in touch with Afghan newcomers who are still need legal assistance and support in submitting their asylum application to the asylum office or in preparing for their interview, please, this is where you can direct them. And thanks to our partners at Human Rights First, they can do a self-directed intake and get plugged into the Welcome Legal Alliance in that way. So with that, I'm going to ask my panelists if there are any further closing remarks that everyone would like to make.
I just put in the chat, just to make everyone aware, we are with various other organizations going to be putting on a CLE webinar on March 24th at 1:30, which is going to take a deeper dive into some of these hot topics around persecutor bar, trig, firm resettlement. Please stay tuned. We will be sharing that link once it's available, once the CLE credits are approved. So we encourage you to attend that, ask your questions, and we'll work on getting you more resources.
And I just also want to mention that folks have been asking about Ask the Expert. We encourage you to use it. We didn't copy the URL in here because it's kind of a long URL, but you can find it on the welcome page that Karen showed. And I will also recirculate an easy link on the different Afghan listservs right after this. And so we encourage you to use it.
And we will also include easier links and direct links in the presentation that we will make, the presentation slides that we will make available with the recording to anyone who registered. I want to thank everyone here for sharing such amazing information and insights. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.